Hi everybody. So in this video I'm going to give a general lecture overview of the different developmental theories that are relevant in lifespan development. Now keep in mind most of these theories we are going to see again at several times in later life stages. So this is kind of a general overview. It's giving you a good introduction to them. For many of you, you've probably heard of some of these before, especially if you've taken like a general psychology course. Usually they talk about Freud, usually they talk about Piaget, usually they talk about Albert Bandura. We'll be adding a few others that you probably aren't as familiar with, like Lev Vygotsky and Yuri Bronfenbrenner. But just keep in mind, right, we are going to be giving an overview. I'm going to be giving an overview here on them. You will definitely be seeing all of these theories mentioned one way or another moving forward. In some of them, like Piaget, Freud, and Erikson's theories, we'll be seeing it several times throughout the semester. So up first, I did want to just clarify something. This is a little bit of a throwback to the previous lecture where we talked a little bit about the scientific method. But I did want to clarify just a little bit, especially what theory is, right? So a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for a behavior and events that is used to make predictions about future observations. We're talking about developmental theories today, right? And this is one thing that sometimes I have students ask questions on. They say, well, if these are theories, then that means they're not proven to be 100% correct because it's just a theory. The use of these words is a little bit different, right? When you're talking about theory in the scientific method, yes, absolutely, right? This is kind of your initial idea, concept, and then that's what you're going to be testing, especially when you're talking about hypothesis, right? Which is even more specific. It's usually one sentence, and that's actually the core of what you're going to be doing the research on, especially like an experiment. We're talking about developmental theories, and I do want to clarify that there are no one theories, really in any kind of social science, but especially in developmental studies, that explains everything. You just kind of can't, right? There's so many variables that come into play. We've already talked about just looking at things like biological development versus psychological versus sociological, all the different factors that come into play with that. I often like to explain it. There's no E equals MC squared that explains every single possible thing a person can experience, as well as what kind of influences they may already have through genetics, heredity, that can describe how people end up the way they are. We just can't do that. So we have many different theories. It doesn't mean that these theories, because they're called theories, don't have a lot of science behind them. They do. Historically, you'll kind of see where theories first develop, even in other sciences, non-social sciences, that are pretty well tested, that are pretty well proven, but they're still called theory. I just always like to clarify that because sometimes I have students that kind of get that confused. The reason why we have so many different theories is because there's so many variables when we talk about social sciences and developmental sciences. So we have to come up with different theories that explain certain parts of it. And I'll kind of come back to this at the end of the lecture today. But I just want to let you all know that in the start, kind of preface this lecture with that. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that a lot of the theories that we're going to be talking about, and certainly when we talk about early theories in developmental studies, there seem to be three main kind of areas of contention that kept coming up. And indeed, this is still kind of something that we look at from time to time when we talk about the way in which development occurs. And it's something I talked about during the last main lecture. So the three main areas of kind of contention or disagreement are passive versus active, continuity versus discontinuity, and then nature versus nurture. So with passive versus active, what we're looking at is the role of early experiences on later development versus current behavior reflecting present experiences. So basically, if we're looking at an adult, is that adult engaging in behaviors, actions, even things like how they perceive the world around them, based actively on them interacting with the environment in the moment, making those choices? That would be more of like the active side of thing. Or is it more passive, where it's just we're comfortable with what we're exposed to, right? If we're raised and we spend 10, 15, 20 years within our family upbringing, our family environment, within our cultures, within all these things that we're experiencing day in and day out, does it just kind of become second nature, where we don't really put a lot of thought, effort, energy into it, and it just becomes more of a passive thing that we just do without really thinking about it. Continuity versus discontinuity. This is definitely something we talked about specifically during the last full lecture. Really what it's looking at here is, does development happen in clear-cut stages, right? So that would be a discontinuous type of growth. Or is it just something that happens little by little, like day by day, bit by bit? That would be continuity, right? So the kind of textbook answer here, whether or not development is best viewed as occurring in stages or as a gradual and cumulative process of change. Third main component on here is nature versus nurture. Also something that we talked about during the last main lecture, and also something that I'm sure most of you are familiar with or have at least heard before. So it's the role of heredity and the environment in shaping human development, right? So if you believe solidly on the nature side of things, that means you are just kind of the byproduct of your genes, of biological processes. If you're more on the nurture side of things, then that means you put more weight into experiences. Now, I clarified this during the last lecture. I'm going to clarify it here. Really, truly, in my mind, there's nobody that's 100% on any one of these, right? There's no person that says absolutely all development happens passively or actively. There's nobody that says 100% it's got to be continuous growth and not discontinuous growth or development. Or nature versus nurture. I think certain aspects of development certainly gravitate more towards one end of the argument here versus others. I certainly think some of the theories we're going to talk about kind of gravitate towards one or the other. And I'll mention those as we go through, and especially the first part of the lecture here is going to talk a little bit about the history of different kind of theoretical views of development. And I'll definitely point out there, all right, this person was a little bit more on the nature side, this person was more on the nurture side, continuous versus discontinuous. It's just something to kind of keep in mind. So as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the history. I don't really like talking a tremendous amount about history unless it's currently relevant, right? And some of these aren't really currently relevant. It's certainly interesting to get a little bit of the back story of how we have arrived where we're at today. But I'll get through this pretty quick. So the actual scientific study of children, of development, really the beginning of developmental studies, really began in about the late 19th century and blossomed in the early 20th century. To be honest, if that sounds like it's fairly recent, it's not uncommon. You know, psychology largely started as a scientific study about the same time, late 1800s. Blossomed early 1900s, has continued since then. Really, truly, most sciences, even things like chemistry, biology, microbiology, physics, even though they have roots that go back hundreds, thousands of years, the science of it really kind of can be traced more to about the 1700s, 1800s. So they're all fairly recent. Some of the early scholars that really contributed to beginning our understanding of how development occurs, especially more on a philosophical aspect, you see listed here. So John Locke proposed that the mind of a newborn was a tabula rasa, or a blank slate in Latin, on which knowledge is written through experience and learning. So going back to that previous slide, he's saying growth and development is all about experiences, right? So that's definitely much more on the nurture side of the equation. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Charles Darwin, on the other hand, were far more on the nature side of things. So Rousseau proposed that development occurs according to innate processes and progresses through three stages: infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Darwin didn't necessarily study child development per se, right? He's best known for his theory of evolution. There's that word theory again. A lot of people latch onto it and say, so evolution isn't proven to be true. Well, it's kind of hard to prove it, right? You can't do an experiment on evolution. I mean, you can, but it'd be a very long experiment that would go beyond most people's life. But we have a pretty huge amount of evidence that supports evolution. So while Darwin didn't specifically study development, a lot of what he did study has been transferred and applied in developmental studies. So obviously both of these men, what their beliefs influence in developmental studies is much more on the nature side of things. But also remember there's discontinuous versus continuous. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he said that it progresses. The process of development goes through 3 stages: infancy, childhood, adolescence. All right. So now we're talking about discontinuous versus continuous growth or development. So applying those terms and actions. A couple other early contributing psychologists and developmental scientists to go over. G. Stanley Hall is the next one. G. Stanley Hall, for those who are interested in going into psychology, was actually the first president of the APA, the American Psychological Association, the governing body of psychologists, and also the organization that you can all blame for having to learn APA writing style in college. So kind of a weird thing to be associated with. I guess what most college students kind of hate whenever they hear the word APA, but it actually does stand for American Psychological Association. G. Stanley Hall also did a lot of early work, besides being president of the APA, a lot of early work looking at developmental studies within children. In fact, he was kind of considered one of the first pioneers in that field. James Baldwin, he conducted quantitative and experimental research on infant development. Again, this is kind of getting into the early 1900s. John Watson, we'll talk about him briefly again a little bit later in the lecture. The founder of the field of behaviorism. Behaviorism, just so you all remember, and again, we'll be talking about this again a little bit, but really is the branch within psychology that focuses on learning, but not learning like studying, learning like how did you learn to behave the way you behave, right? So this is much more influenced by what has happened to us passively as we've grown, things that we've associated in our own mind. John Watson, even though he wasn't the person who first discovered some of the basic aspects of learning, he was the first person to really apply it in fields of psychology. Below that, you see Sigmund Freud. In my mind, probably arguably one of the most influential and best known psychologists, really of all time. I would say even up to today, when you hear somebody say the word Sigmund Freud, people usually kind of instantly know who that is. Hugely influential, even though a lot of the stuff that he came up with, I would say isn't really a part of the modern science of psychology, but it laid a really solid foundation. He's most associated with the psychoanalytical approach and the model of psychosexual development. We'll be talking about him again too here in a little bit. Arnold Gesell. So he conducted the first large-scale study of children's behavior that revealed consistent patterns of development. He focused on biological maturation, so he was more on the nature side of things, much more on the biological side. And then another gentleman we're going to be talking about in the lecture today is Jean Piaget, very, very well known. It says here, stage theory of cognitive development. Arguably, I've heard Jean Piaget kind of referenced more than anybody else as being sort of the father of developmental psychology. He certainly has spent his entire career focusing on the cognitive development of children and adolescents. And he's one of the people that his theories that we're going to be talking about throughout the semester. So let's start with Freud. And kind of to preface this, right, we're talking about developmental theories. Most of these theories are psychological theories. A few of them are more like psychosocial theories. The reason for that is there's a lot more variables and it's a lot more, we have to have a lot of different theories for psychosocial development versus biological development, right? And when you kind of think about that, it just kind of sort of makes sense, right? There's no theory of why we go through puberty. There's no theory of how aging occurs. There's different views of aging and the processes of aging, but when we're talking about biological sciences, it's a little bit more clear cut. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is going to be psychosocial aspects of development. So let's start with Freud. Freud's psychodynamic perspective. This dominated the field of psychiatry until the growth of behaviorism in about the 1930s. It proposed that personality forms during the first few years of life. He also proposed that the ways in which parents or other caregivers interact with children have a long-lasting impact on the children's emotions, behavior, and personality. And he suggested the first purely psychological explanation for physical problems and mental illnesses. Freud and the psychodynamic perspective, sometimes you see that reference as psychoanalytical perspective, that kind of, the difference on that can be blurred sometimes. So really what Freud had in mind, early Freudian kind of thought, is that basically it was the first psychological theory that was comprehensive. It talked about why people develop or how people develop psychologically. It talked about different stages that they go through. It talked about how maladaptive ways of development could lead to psychological issues later in life. And it developed different ways of treating those psychological issues. So it was the first real comprehensive theory in psychology. At the root of this theory, you see it all the way at the bottom here, a real big core part of this was that Freud believed that we had a whole part of our minds that we weren't really aware of. We had a whole unconscious aspect. And even though we're not really fully aware of our unconscious mind, it still motivates us. It still kind of influences us into our conscious mind, the things we are aware of, that we can think about, we can talk about. Now, early on in life, what Freud really believed kind of propelled us, which we'll talk about here when we talk about the stages of his theory, were kind of more animalistic tendencies. And what he believed is that kind of as these animalistic tendencies clash with morals and the way that we just live our life, that we kind of develop a lot of shame, guilt, doubt, fear, anxiety, and our way of kind of managing these in childhood, in adolescence, and into adulthood really shapes who we are. So whenever you hear things talking about unconscious mind, subconscious mind, or motivations, kind of immediately go to Freud, right? That's kind of the meat and potatoes of his theory. Now, a big part of this unconscious mind and conscious mind was that Freud believed that we also had three main components to our personality. And he often explained it in this way. Usually you see this in most textbooks, that you can kind of relate your personality to being sort of like an iceberg floating in the ocean. So if you've ever heard this, right, icebergs in the ocean, only a small percentage of the ice is actually like above the water. I think it's like 10%, right? Only like 10% or a small percentage of that ice is actually visible. It's above the water. Most of it is below the water. Well, this is an analogy, right? So everything above the water is like the consciousness. It's the stuff you can see, the stuff you notice, the stuff you're aware of. In Freud's view, then, that meant like a large part of your personality, a large part of who you are is actually in the unconscious. It's below the water. Now, he believed there was three main components to your personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. The way that this works is that he believed that your id was sort of like the basic central part of your personality, sort of like the innate, inherent part of who you were. It's the more animalistic, the more basic part of what humans are. So the id includes our instincts, our drives. It is propelled by the pleasure principle. So basically it just wants what it wants when it wants it, right? And it wants it because it feels good. Freud would say that it was propelled by the libido, right? So the libido is sort of like this innate motivation for us to just kind of achieve things that are physically pleasurable. Early on in life, and again, keep in mind, like Freud believed that id was kind of always present, pretty much present at birth, or at least very soon thereafter. Early on, this libido, what's kind of motivating, propelling, even though that word, if you've heard it before, usually is referred to as like sexual libido, Freud didn't necessarily think it was sexual early on. He thought it was more like a focus on physical pleasure. Now, that libido later in life, as we sexually mature, does have more of a sexual overtone to it. But early on, it was just sort of like physical pleasure. Now, here's the thing, right? The id is present early in life. The id is present in infancy. As a child begins to grow, though, they start to understand, they don't always get it their way, right? They don't always get what they want when they want it. That there's rules, that there's morals, that there's things that they need to do and not do. That in some cases, that requirement or that motivation to fulfill certain physical urges may be inappropriate. So what ends up happening is we start kind of developing an idea of the sense of rules, the senses of morality, of right and wrong. What ends up forming is our superego. So the superego starts to emerge at around age 5. It's more rules-based. It acts as our conscious. Now, even though the ego really starts to form at about 3 years of age, what ends up happening, the ego sort of works as a balancing act between the id and the superego. So what the ego is, you probably heard that term before. If you ever have, and I'm sure you have, think to yourself, if you didn't know who Freud was, Freud developed these terms, right? And that's part of our everyday usage. You ever hear somebody has an ego problem or something like that, right? Really what the ego is the rational part of our personality. Whereas the id operates on the pleasure principle, the ego operates on the reality principle, right? So not just getting what you want when you want it, but what can you actually realistically achieve so that it doesn't lead to conflict, tension, anything like that, within the rules, operating with the rules realistically. Now, really what happens here is that the ego kind of plays referee because the id and the superego are really, really, really at odds with one another. Right? The id wants what it wants when it wants it. It operates on the pleasure principle. If it feels good, do it. Superego, right, wrong, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, following the rules, morality, all this other stuff, right? So obviously they're going to kind of butt heads. So the ego comes in and it tries to balance this a little bit. It tries to kind of give the id what it wants, but to do it in a way that's more socially acceptable and minimizes any kind of guilt. In many ways, the way I like to always explain the id, ego, superego is sort of like those old-timey like cartoons where like say a character is trying to figure out what they should or shouldn't do, and then like a devil pulls up on one shoulder and it's trying to get the person just to do what they want, and then the angel pulls up on the other shoulder and it's saying what the person should do, right? What would be right to do, and then they're kind of like opposing one another. Now, according to Freud, and going back to the whole iceberg analogy here, he believed your id really was always kind of in the unconscious. It was always below water. And even just a small amount of the superego and ego were really kind of visible to us that we were aware of. But again, remember, just because they're rooted in our unconscious and most of it's in our unconscious, that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't still kind of leak into our consciousness, at least according to Freud. Now, based upon really the focus of that libido I mentioned earlier, Freud developed different stages of development. And when we talk about Freud's views, his theory applied to development, we call it the psychosocial theory of development, or theory of psychosexual development. So in each of these stages, the child's pleasure-seeking urges, that libido, that need to fulfill certain enjoyable physical needs or wants, urges, are applied to certain areas, right? They're applied to certain, to be frank, parts of our body. And I'm going to warn y'all, this is where things sometimes get a little weird with Freud. So early on, within the first year of life, what Freud believed was that children had a focus of this physical pleasure through their mouth. So he called it the oral stage. And the reason for this is breastfeeding, right? If you've ever seen young babies, they are always putting things in their mouth. They kind of are exploring the world through their mouth in some ways. So Freud believed that this was the area that a child was focused on, that this libido was focused on. Oftentimes in that case, then what becomes kind of a problem, and that's the thing, like there's certain like little hurdles or sometimes conflicts that come up. And one of the big little conflicts that comes up in the oral stage is being weaned off of being breastfed towards the bottle, certainly past that 1 year-ish, if not sooner, going maybe to different types of foods, maybe even getting off the bottle. One thing that's kind of interesting with Freud is that he believed in these stages that basically if a child had issues, and usually the issues is like guilt, conflict, some kind of interaction with the caregiver or people around them that influence them having more shame or doubt in themselves, that it could lead to problems later in life. So with Freud, what he believed was that, say, if a parent, a caregiver, was overly giving with feeding their child. Say you're a young mother, you're breastfeeding your child, the child's always fussy, crying, but you notice if you feed the child stops. So you may have a tendency to kind of give the child a lot of feeding, to feed them quite a bit. Well, what would happen then, according to Freud, was that this child would become kind of fixated in this stage of soothing themselves through their mouth. So later in life, they may have issues with things like overeating, smoking. This may be the reason why people do things like chew their fingernails when they're nervous. Again, according to Freud. Once we get through this first year of life, we go into what Freud called the anal stage. Right, so now the area of the libido being focused on is on the anus, hence why he called it the anal stage. Really the big thing in this stage, the big conflict, is learning to control going to the bathroom, becoming toilet trained. Again, Freud believed that if there were major issues with this stage, it could lead to problems later in life. So, for example, if you had caregivers that were overly strict with you and made you feel kind of like ashamed or bad during the toilet training process, Freud believed that that could lead to you being more what he called anal retentive, right? So you can become fixated in this stage, and it can be where you were overly demanding of yourself, overly strict and rigid. Freud believed that this could lead to adults who kind of had like what we would call today like OCD and be overly kind of rigid in their thinking. The opposite is also true, though. So Freud believed that if you had children who maybe weren't given enough kind of guidance and advice here, that could lead to them having issues with kind of being unhygienic, sloppy, messy later in life. Kind of to connect the dots on this would be like, instead of somebody who has like OCD or is like a quote unquote neat freak, these kids would be like the hoarders when they get older in life. Now, one thing I do want to clarify, because already you're probably like, this is some weird stuff. Why are you talking about this? Like, this is kind of weird, maybe a little cringy. For the longest time, I did not put a lot of weight into Freud and his theory. And probably like many of you, I thought this is some weird stuff. However, I will say there was an event that happened while I've been teaching where a student wanted to meet me after class. I met with the student. It was somebody who was a younger mother, and they had a child who was going through potty training. And she basically wanted to ask me about, whether or not she should be worried. But the way that she said it was that her daughter doesn't like her and is intentionally refusing to become potty trained to spite her. And all of a sudden it kind of came to me, and I'm like, I kind of get Freud now. Because here's a young child learning a basic behavior that you will use throughout your entire life, and it's being kind of blurred into this weird situation by the child's mother of vindictiveness, control, manipulation. And this also kind of signals that conscious versus unconscious or subconscious aspects of Freud, because I certainly don't remember being potty trained. I doubt any of you remember being potty trained. And I can tell you, even if you do remember it, you probably don't remember it clearly because memories are just being formed at that stage and they're extremely flexible. Our memories overall throughout life are extremely fragile and easily manipulated. So you probably don't remember it clearly. But yet we do these behaviors every day. So imagine early on in life if something that simple is being tied into all these implications. Will that child have a problem later in life? Maybe, maybe not. But I wouldn't be surprised either. So after the anal stage, we have the phallic stage. So this is about 3 to 6. Ages with Freud are kind of flexible, like, everything else in developmental studies. It's not like there's this magic thing that all of us go through from, the second birthday to the third birthday that changes overnight once we hit our third birthday. But generally speaking, it's about 3 to 6. So the focus here, or the erogenous zone, where the libido is focused, is on the genitals. Now, that does not mean it is sexualized in any way. To be kind of blunt, little boys start to explore what makes them little boys. Little girls start to explore what makes them little girls. It's not sexual in nature. It's more of like an inquisitiveness. But it certainly can be terrifying, right? Especially if you're a parent and you're getting a call from school or from a kindergarten or something like that saying that your little boy just exposed himself to the whole class or your little girl just exposed herself to the whole class. Perfectly normal, perfectly innocent, maybe something that you don't really want to think about as a parent, but it happens. And that's really part of this whole phallic stage. Now, this is a very controversial part of Freud's theory. It's certainly not part of modern psychology, but what Freud believed was that early on in this kind of phallic stage, this was when gender identity started to take shape, our idea of gender roles started to take shape, sexual expressions, even though it wasn't sexualized. And part of this is that young children kind of started to identify with the opposite sex parent. So what Freud believed was that little boys would start kind of being more interested in their mothers. Not necessarily in a sexual way or in a loving way, but they may just have more affection for the mother, and that little girls did the same for their fathers. Now, in Freud's day, he believed it was completely sex-based, so if you were born a boy, then you would have this connection with your mother, and with girls, vice versa. That's not really part of mainstream psychology, but if you see that on their Oedipus and Electra complex, that's what it's referring to. Now, depending on how children kind of go through this, it can lead to different issues with self-esteem, with vanity, overambition, things like that. As we go from about 6 to 12, we enter into the latent stage or latency. And Freud believed this was really driven by a lack of libido, a lack of a focus of this physical, pleasureful motivation that we have. What replaced it isn't a physical, pleasureful urge or motivation, but rather social motivations, right? Because kids are going to school, so really they're focused on school, they're focused on sports, they're focused on friends, they're focused on family, they're focused on Christmas and the Easter Bunny and all kinds of other stuff. What changes all this, what comes crashing to a halt for the childhood, is once a child starts going into puberty. Once they start going into puberty, they exit that latency stage and they enter into the genital. It's actually mistyped on this PowerPoint. It says general, it should be genital stage. In the genital stage, what ends up happening is that the child's interest goes back to their genitals, except this time it's more of a sexual urge, sexual nature. That's what differentiates it from the phallic stage. According to Freud, that was it, right? Your development stops, you go into puberty, you start developing sexual urges, and you're in that stage for the rest of your life until you die. For this reason, with Freud, one important thing to remember is that pretty much his stages stop at adolescence. Now, I already went through all these stages. You can certainly see where I have them listed here a little bit clearer, where we talk about the oral stage, what part of the id, ego, superego is actually present, consequences of, if a child becomes more fixated in different stages. So I'm just going to kind of briefly go through this very quickly. Now, one very critical part of Freud's beliefs that are actually kind of still present in psychology to this day, at least as far as what my experience has been, is defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are also one of those areas of Freud's theory that are a little easier to test and to study. One of the kind of big drawbacks, which there's a section here a little bit that talks about pros and cons, but one of the big drawbacks with Freud is that a lot of the stuff he came up with, even though it kind of makes sense, maybe logic can be applied and you're like, yeah, it makes sense to me. It is very difficult to test that, right? So for example, his beliefs about personality, how do you do an experiment of unconscious thought, right? That's really super difficult inherently to do, right? Because if I did an experiment that it's basically saying, can you do an experiment that finds out if there's things that influence a person's thinking that they're not aware of? That's weird, right? And even if you did find it, then you could always make the argument of, well, was it really in your unconscious because it was something that was influenced? It just gets difficult. But the defense mechanisms is something that actually are very much so common in modern psychology. So there's a couple of them here. We have denial, displacement, projection, rationalization, reaction formation, regression, repression, and then sublimation. I'll go over these real briefly, kind of give you some examples of it. One thing to keep in mind, this is a fun little trick, way to apply what we're learning in class, learning in this video in the real life, is think of these, keep them in the back of your mind, maybe even jot them down. And just as you live your life day to day, kind of notice it. Notice other people using these. That'll be easy. Notice yourself starting to use them. That'll be a little bit more difficult. But I assure you, we all use them. You will see this, and you'll see it really quick. It's actually a big insight into, how people's minds work. So we'll start with denial. Denial is not accepting the truth or lying to yourself. So usually what this is that we just kind of don't want to face facts. We don't want to, reality we get. I understand it. I understand logic. I understand facts. But, it's just really inconvenient. So I'm just not going to do it. I'm just going to kind of look the other way, bury my head in the sand. Is it logical? No. But a lot of things with psychology is illogical, right? There's a common saying, feelings aren't facts. People do illogical things all the time. We just choose to kind of block it out and pretend like it's not there. And that's really denial. Displacement, taking out frustrations on a safer target. So oftentimes, sadly, you see where displacement rears its ugly head with things like child abuse, right? So if I'm an adult, if I'm a father, if I'm a mother, and I just have a really poor self-esteem, maybe I got stuff going on, I have some emotional problems, and, maybe I'm at work and my boss is really just writing my case. They're constantly yelling and screaming at me. I have really low self-esteem. I feel belittled. Well, you know what? Maybe I go home and I'm going to take that out on my kid, right? I can't tell my boss off because I can get fired. I'm not going to go pick a fight with another adult on the street because they may kick my butt. But I can take it out on my kids. I can belittle them. I can abuse them. And they're a safe target because I'm not going to get fired. I'm not going to get my butt beaten. At least not by my kids, right? I'm not saying do that, by the way. I'm just saying that's an example of displacement. Oftentimes, too, anybody who works in a service industry, I feel like this is a form of abuse, too. And you see where people are really quick to kind of belittle and demean you, right? So what I'm saying is I'm a waiter at a restaurant, and I notice that, some customers are really picky and they're really specific and they kind of belittle and demean you and they kind of make you jump through all these hoops for you. Sometimes, sadly, people who work in service industries are safe targets, right? Because in the United States, at least, what's the idea, right? The customer is always right. And you always try to, be upbeat and happy. And certainly if you tell off a customer, depending on where you work, depending on what's happening, you may end up getting in trouble for that. So people know it, so they take advantage of it. That's displacement. Projection. So this is a little bit different. It's attributing unacceptable thoughts to others. So if I'm in a relationship with somebody and I cheated on them or I want to cheat on them, all of a sudden now I'm getting real skeptical. I'm really kind of wondering, I'm like, I bet they're cheating on me, right? And you start accusing them of cheating on you, right? You're really the one doing it. You're the one having those thoughts, but you're projecting it onto the other person. Rationalization. This is one of my favorite ones. I can tell you as a therapist, this is one of the ones that are probably the most common. So rationalization involves a cognitive distortion of the facts to make an event or an impulse less threatening. Now, it says less threatening on there. You can kind of use that word threatening very loosely. A lot of times what you see with rationalization, kind of going back to the id, ego, superego, is that the id just really wants something. But you know if you give into it, you're going to feel guilty. So your ego kind of minimizes that guilt a little bit. You can kind of think of it as sort of like justifying it. So I'll give you an example, right? I'm on a diet, very strict diet. Maybe I'm just eating fruit and vegetables, right? No carbs, no meat, no dairy. I'm just going to live off fruit and vegetables. But, after a couple of days, I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, oh my God, I really want a cheeseburger. I would love a cheeseburger, right? Dying for a cheeseburger. I know if I eat that cheeseburger, I'm going to feel guilty because it's not on my diet. I may feel guilt. I may feel hopelessness because it's like, man, I'm trying so hard, but yet I keep wanting to eat this food. So rationalization may come in where it says something like, you had a hard day and you've been so good. You've done several days on this diet. So you deserve a treat, right? And who cares? It's just one. I mean, you did 5 days of really good dieting. So what is one cheeseburger going to do, right? This is the rationalization part. You could probably see and apply that in a lot of different areas. You can see why I said as a therapist, I can say rationalization is probably one of the most common. Reaction formation. So reaction formation is sort of interesting. It's outwardly opposing something you inwardly desire, but that you find unacceptable. Reaction formation is kind of a weird one, and it's one that sometimes gets misunderstood quite a bit. So a good example of reaction formation is, imagine somebody who's just kind of like a grumpy, mean, kind of miserable person, but they're going to go out of their way to just pretend like they're super happy, and they're just going to be so over the top happy. And sometimes it almost comes across as like sarcasm or even passive aggressiveness, but like they're trying, right? That would be an example of the reaction formation. Reaction formation does come up in quite a lot of different areas, but I would say it's not as common as, say, rationalization. Regression. So going back to a time when the world felt like a safer place, perhaps reverting to one's childhood behaviors. Regression is kind of interesting because it's something that we do sometimes in psychology and therapy intentionally. But some people also do it just kind of unintentionally. Oftentimes where I've seen really good examples of regression is where somebody's gone through a really significant, severe trauma. I've seen people go through some pretty traumatic experiences and, they would just want to lay in bed and they kind of curl up like in a fetal position, like with their knees tucked in, their arms crossed, and they may just rock. I've seen grown adults, and I mean adults, people's in their 40s and 50s, suck their thumb. Now, I said sometimes we intentionally do this, right? In therapy, I would never make somebody suck their thumb or curl up in the fetal position in their bed. But sometimes, actually, the stress management techniques, we go back to those earlier things. I've had clients use coloring books. I've had them use building blocks. I've had them even play with toys sometimes. Because it's just kind of fun and it's relaxing and sometimes just breaks the ice a little bit. It helps the person calm down. That could also be viewed as a form of regression. But usually when we use that term, it is more of like what I mentioned earlier. Repression. So repression is punishing or pushing painful thoughts out of consciousness. So in other words, thinking about something else. Repression is probably one of the more controversial defense mechanisms. What Freud believed was that some events were just so traumatic that you kind of automatically just push them into your unconscious mind. The reason why this is controversial is that this kind of opens the door for the idea that, say, somebody could experience a really severe trauma, like being molested as a child, and not remember it because it's part of their unconsciousness. It was repressed back, and that could be unlocked later. There's a lot of controversy about that because, again, memories are kind of fluid, very fragile, easily manipulated. And also, usually the way it works is that really, really strong emotional memories or events lead to really strong memories. But not always. And of course, we can't say 100% of the time. Last one on here is probably the most, I would say, healthy or adaptive is sublimation. So sublimation is transforming unacceptable urges into more socially acceptable behaviors. Usually an example given of this would be something like, say you're a parent and your child is killed by a drunk driver. Your natural urge there is going to be, I want to kill this person who killed my kid, right? I have anger. I'm upset. I'm depressed. So instead of giving into those urges, it would be doing something like campaigning for stricter drunk driving laws. As a therapist, I may look at it as sublimation could be a healthier way of dealing with some of these unhealthy defense mechanisms. Say my boss is being a jerk. I have a lot of low self-esteem. Maybe instead of focusing on picking on a waiter or a waitress somewhere or picking on your kids or people that you view as being easy targets, maybe you use sublimation and you work on yourself. Maybe you find an easier outlet for that. Maybe you go for runs. Maybe you have more therapeutic things that you engage in. So assessing the psychodynamic perspective. So during Freud's era in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century, there was a climate of sexual repression combined with limited understanding and education surrounding human sexuality, which heavily influenced Freud's perspective. There have been a lot of criticisms of Freud's theory, and again, I'd say most of what he came up with isn't really necessarily part of mainstream psychology today, even though it undoubtedly influenced the development of what is mainstream psychology today. So some of these criticisms, first one is very difficult to test scientifically. A lot of what Freud came up with isn't really falsifiable. If you ask me, does it make sense? I'd say, yeah, it makes sense, but again, how do you do an experiment on it? Really hard. Freud's theory is considered to be sexist. It's a byproduct of his day and age, right? Early 20th century. A lot of what Freud came up with, like the idea that little boys were attracted to their mothers, little girls were attracted to their fathers, certainly isn't the most up-to-date theory today by any means, and also really strongly implies just heteronormativity that really isn't really kind of widely regarded today either. The third part on here, Freud suggested that much of what determines our actions is unknown or unconscious. So that makes it kind of difficult because, how do you do therapy for something that the person doesn't remember? And that opened the door then for a lot of other kind of weird quasi-scientific stuff like dream interpretation and other aspects of psychodynamic perspective that really isn't mainstream. One thing I will say, just kind of overall, and it says here, despite the criticisms, Freud's assumptions about the importance of early childhood experiences in shaping our psychological selves have found their way into child development, education, parenting practices. One thing I will always give Freud a lot of credit for, besides just being the first person to actually try to do something to help people, is that remember that this background of where he came from, right? Climate of sexual repression, really during kind of the Victorian era, very conservative times. Certainly the world 120 plus years ago was quite different than it is today. Think about this. Freud talked openly about sexual violence, about molestation, about incest. Importantly, he talked about it because he tried to help people who were victimized by those. He talked about how much of an impact those events had on those folks' lives and tried to help them. Those are topics that are still very much not talked about to this day. All of those are crimes, and they're crimes that are significantly underreported because they're so taboo. But he was talking openly about it and trying to help people who were affected by it over 100 years ago. So I will always give him a lot of credit for that. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting, right? Freud, I always say he cast a long shadow, right? He was so influential. He was so well known that while he was alive, he was really psychology. When he passed away, and certainly towards the end of his career also, he started to influence, though, a lot of other therapists that kind of took some of the main parts of his beliefs and then started to apply them in different ways. One of the people who is a good example of this was Erik Erikson. I always like to joke he had the name so nice that he had to use it twice, right? Erik Erikson. So Erikson was a student of Freud's. He did study under Freud, and he did like a lot of what Freud had come up with, right? So you see that here. Erikson is a student of Freud's, expanded Freud's theory of psychosexual development by emphasizing the importance of culture and parenting practices and motivations and adding 3 stages of adult development. So Erikson contrasts with Freud in that Erikson proposed an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan. So remember, Freud pretty much, you're done at adolescence. You're done once you hit puberty, and then you're in that genital stage throughout your whole life. Well, Erikson didn't really buy into that, and he believed, no, like, there's a huge difference between an 18-year-old and an 80-year-old, right? Or even a 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old. So he believed this was a continuous process that went past adolescence. Erikson also emphasized social relationships. And in fact, you can think of Erikson as replacing the conflict. So we still have conflicts and tensions with Erikson's psychosocial theory, just like we did with Freud, right? Freud believed we had these conflicts, tensions, but for that, it was this libido, these pleasureful urges that led to the conflict and the tension. With Erikson, it's psychosocial interactions. So it's how you interact with other people and how that influences your thoughts. Still leads to conflict and tension, still focuses on how you go through these different stages. It's just what's causing it is more like social interactions and tensions rather than libido. So there's 8 stages to Erikson's theory. I'm going to go through the first 4 on this slide. I'll go through the second 4 on the next slide. There's a reason why these are broken up into different slides, though. So the first 4 really generally kind of corresponds to infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, middle childhood, roughly. One thing about Erikson is that the ages he put on here, like everything else, are flexible. They're not necessarily concrete. So just kind of keep that in mind. And remember, with his theory, we're talking about different stages. So this is a discontinuous theory. And that in each of these, there's sort of this psychosocial conflict that has to be overcome. The first 4 stages through really middle childhood tend to be fairly concrete, though, in that you kind of have to go through one stage at a time. The last 4 stages, though, have a little bit more flexibility. I'll explain that in the next slide. So first one we go through within the first year of life, the stage is trust versus mistrust. And really what we're trying to get from here, what we're trying to overcome is, this sense of hope. What Erikson believed was that in this stage, the key part of what a child was going through is just basically, can they trust their caregiver? Is the caregiver there for them? Are they supportive of them? We'll talk about this in later videos, but can they view the caregiver in their lives as being a security blanket, right? A safety feature. We talk about attachment later in the semester. So that's really the key part of trust versus mistrust. Once we start going into roughly toddlerhood, we go into autonomy versus shame. And this is where a child starts to develop will. So they begin to explore their world and learn that they can control their actions and act on their environment to get results. To me, that sounds sort of like controlling, manipulative. Certainly anybody who has a kid going through the terrible twos would probably say, yep, that sounds about right. Keep in mind, right, this isn't necessarily a logical part. It's just where a kid starts understanding, oh, okay, if I do this, I get this. If I have this kind of behavior, then there's some kind of reaction to it. They don't really connect the dots necessarily yet, but they're beginning to understand kind of this cause and effect relationship, if you will. As they continue to grow, and now they're going into early childhood, they go through a stage of initiative versus guilt. And the purpose of this stage is to establish some kind of purpose, right? So the children are beginning to kind of expand on this cause and effect. They're capable of initiating activities at this point, right? So it's not just this passive part with autonomy versus shame that they're saying, oh, hey, well, if I do this, this happens, right? With initiative versus guilt, it's, gee, I would really like to do this. During the stage, it becomes then in some ways more of an active establishment of this cause and effect. As kids continue to grow, they're going to middle childhood. They're into the industry versus inferiority stage. And in this stage, really, they're establishing a sense of competence. So elementary school children either develop a sense of pride and accomplishment in their schoolwork, sports, social activities, family life, or they feel inferior and inadequate because they believe they do not measure up. We'll see this as we go into later life stages, especially middle childhood, that oftentimes in the stage, this is where kids are beginning to have a sense of like self-esteem, self-confidence, things like that. One thing that's kind of interesting, the industry part of this also is a level of inquisitivity in their world. So sometimes quite literally, children are just kind of thirsty for knowledge. They're desperate. I know certainly when I was going through this stage, I literally wanted to see how things work, right? So it's kind of like a big part of the stage, right? You're trying to see how things work. That can be more of like an abstract concept or literal, right? I was a literal kid. If I saw an alarm clock, I'd break open that alarm clock because I wanted to see what was inside. I wanted to literally see how it worked. Just kind of know that, right? That's sort of a big part of the stage also. So remember, these tend to go kind of in order. You sort of have to, right? So kids have to go through trust versus mistrust one way or another, right? Either they do it in a healthy way, they trust their caregivers, or they don't. They're still going to go on to the next stage. And this happens in order. It happens sequentially. The next four, though, tend to be a little bit more flexible, right? So now we're talking about basically adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. So during adolescence, Erikson believed that you started to go through a period of identity versus role confusion. So basically, in your adolescent years, you're trying to figure out who you are, right? The main task is developing a sense of self. You start to explore various roles, various ideas. You set goals. Typically, you reevaluate those goals and you set different goals, and usually you change your mind several times because, again, you're trying to figure out even who you are. Oftentimes in this, big part of adolescence, I'm sure most of you can relate to this, is just trying on different hats, figuring out different things. Maybe 1 week you are huge into environmental causes and you're a vegan and you're all this other stuff. And then the next week, who knows what, you're into something totally different. Very classic in the stage. And in fact, in some ways, something that should be kind of encouraged. Now, remember, I said these are a little bit more flexible. I can tell you, while certainly I agree this is a very common trend with teenagers, with adolescents, I've also known people well into their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that are trying to figure out who they are. For some people, it's almost part of the fun, right? It's sort of like, that's part of who I am, is I just constantly reinvent myself. So a little bit more flexible, right? Especially as compared to those previous four stages. Next one's another great example of it. So Erikson believed as we go into early adulthood, we start to have this intimacy versus isolation stage. So basically what you're doing is you're getting friends. You're, in Erikson's view, right, this is the big part, you're finding somebody, romantic partner, to start a family with. Keep in mind, Erikson, byproduct of his age, right, we're talking about the mid part of the 20th century. Really what he said was, starting in your 20s, you're trying to find a husband or a wife and you're starting to have kids. Now, here's where it gets, like I said, more flexible, right? Certainly, are there people who have kids in their teens? Yeah. Are there people who have kids and don't get married until their 30s, 40s, 50s? Yeah. Are there people who just don't ever get married or have kids? Absolutely. Erikson and how it's applied now, we would also say this is sort of like finding friends and how friends sometimes and outside relationships may start to have more importance than even family relationships, or as important as family relationships also, right? So that's that intimacy versus isolation. It doesn't always necessarily just mean romantic love, but it's finding those social connections. As we go into middle adulthood, we go into generativity versus stagnation. The purpose here is to find a sense of care and care for ourselves. So people in middle adulthood, about 40s to mid-60s, start to become concerned with finding their life's work and contributing to the development of others. Really, you can kind of think of this as being the classic example of quote-unquote the midlife crisis, where you're trying to find some sense of purpose. Why am I on this earth? What am I leaving behind? What did I do with my life? That's kind of the idea here of the generativity versus stagnation. Oftentimes in this stage, you see where people start to engage or try to engage in more meaningful activities, work, that kind of early and middle adulthood, that push to be more successful or to achieve more things. Or sometimes it can be where people are more welcoming in their idea of being kind of a more experienced person at work, where now they're going to take on more of like a mentoring role with newer people coming in. And then finally, the last stage here is integrity versus despair. Erikson believed this corresponded to really late adulthood, that people in late adulthood are concerned with reflecting on their lives and feeling either a sense of pride and satisfaction or a sense of regret and failure. So all of these stages so far that we've talked about have been more like future focused or present focused. As we go into the integrity versus despair in late adulthood, it's really more past focused, right? You're not really thinking about the future. You're not even really thinking about the present. You're thinking about how you lived your life, the mistakes that you made. You're reflecting back. And sometimes you see where this is the stage then where people do try to go back and maybe right some of the wrongs, either actively or just passively. They do try to change their lives. Or, they don't. They just kind of wallow in the despair, or sometimes where we have some of those defense mechanisms pop in of just being in denial about certain things because they're just kind of uncomfortable. So assessing Erikson's theory, definitely one of the strengths here is that Erikson did create a theory that goes throughout the entire lifespan. It's discontinuous in nature, but it goes really from birth to death. Some of the weaknesses here, stages or crises can occur more than once or at different times in life. So I said especially those last 4 stages can be a little bit more flexible. Some of the criticisms are that Erikson's stages focus heavily on the stage aspect and the discontinuous nature and assume that the completion of one stage is a prerequisite for the next stage. Again, that's definitely much more present for the last 4 stages rather than for the first 4. Focuses on the social expectations that are found in certain cultures, but not all. So a great example of this, not just different culture, but different time, right? What I mentioned about intimacy versus isolation. Well, in Erikson's days, it was the idea that you're in your 20s, go get married, have kids. That has kind of shifted. And in fact, when you look at generativity versus some people do actively say, look, I want to go out, I want to make an impact, I want to do great things. And then when I'm comfortable, then when I'm safe, then when I have a good job or whatever, I'll focus on family. So in that way, you're kind of reversing those stages. But again, that's kind of culture dependent quite a bit. Focuses on more men than women. One of the big kind of drawbacks to a lot of these early theories, you'll notice when I went over that list a little while ago, they're all men, right? Most of the people who had a huge impact in developmental studies early on were men. So obviously that's going to kind of skew a little bit the perspective. And the final one on here, it's difficult to test rigorously because of its vagueness. We have the same problem with Erikson's theory as we did with Freud. A lot of this makes sense, but does it stand up to scientific scrutiny? With Erikson, yeah, a little bit it does, but not entirely. So that is sort of the psychoanalytical, psychodynamic perspective. We're going to transition now and go into the behavioral perspective. Behaviorism really started to emerge in about the 20th century. Really, in the early part of psychology, the two big pillars were the psychodynamic perspective or psychoanalytical perspective and behaviorism. That was kind of the two main aspects of psychology. With behaviorism, the focus was a little bit different, though. With psychoanalytical, it was more like internal processes of growth. With behaviorism, it was stuff that was easily seen, studied, measured. So it was more like external aspects of behavior. So they believed that the key to understanding development was through observable behavior and external stimuli. Behaviorism refers to theories of learning that focus on how we respond to events or stimuli rather than emphasizing the internal factors, right? That was more of Freud and the psychoanalytical. One thing to clarify, though, we're talking about learning. Almost everybody naturally makes the assumption when you say learning, learned, any variation of that word, you think of studying. You think of a very active process, but most learning takes place in a passive way. When we talk about learning with behaviorism, we're really talking about how you've experienced things throughout your life, how you've learned associations that influence your behaviors. Right, so it's a much larger application of that word learning. With behaviorism, because it focuses on observable behaviors, it focuses on external stimuli, it is a little bit more scientifically sound also. Now, there's many different aspects to behaviorism. And just like in previous kind of lecture videos, I do have other videos that explain these a little bit better. So I'll just briefly go over it, kind of read the PowerPoint. But if you want to know more about them, please watch those other videos. And for many of you, I'm sure this is kind of a refresher if you have taken a general psychology course. So there's three main types of learning that are associated with behaviorism. It's classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and then the final one is observational learning. So classical conditioning was famously discovered by a Russian, it says physiologist here. He's actually a medical doctor named Ivan Pavlov, who was doing a series of experiments on digestion. He wanted to see what role actually salivation, the production of saliva, plays in our digestive systems. So he conducted a series of experiments where he fed dogs, measured the amount of saliva they produced, found out that they started to produce that saliva not just with food being present, but through hearing the sound of the bell. So they started to salivate literally at the sound of a bell, right? That's classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is where we are associating a behavior with some sort of stimuli. So it says here, classical conditioning helps us understand how our responses to one situation become attached or connected to new situations. A dog salivating over food is perfectly natural, but associating a bell with that food to where they now salivate over the bell, even if food isn't around, is having a connection. You're connecting with that bell and you're associating it with something else. That's classical conditioning. Again, go over the video if you want to know more information about how that classical conditioning actually takes place. Now, even though Ivan Pavlov was the person who actually discovered classical conditioning, remember, he's a physiologist. He was working on digestion. Kind of interesting. He won the Nobel Prize for his research. But really his biggest contribution in that with classical conditioning, at least in developmental studies, was a fluke, right? That wasn't what he was actually studying. It was just something that was a byproduct of it. The person who actually kind of picked up that football and ran with it was James Watson, somebody we talked about a little bit earlier, right? So Watson's oftentimes considered the father of behaviorism because he took what Ivan Pavlov discovered, started to apply it to humans, started to applying it to how we learn to associate behaviors. So he's known for applying classical conditioning principles to human behavior. He believed that most of our fears and other emotional responses are classically conditioned. Also, that parents could be taught to help shape their children's behavior. He tried to demonstrate the power of classical conditioning with his famous experiment of an 18-month-old boy named Little Albert. That was not his name. His name wasn't Albert. As a pseudonym, he called him Little Albert. So the little Albert experiment, very famous. If you haven't heard of it, basically what he did was he took a young child, 18-month-old, and exposed the child to a mouse with white fur, a rat with white fur. Kids naturally, don't have fear of things that a lot of humans have, a lot of adults have fear of, like snakes and bugs and rats and mice and stuff like that, right? But young children are really sensitive to sound. So what he would do is show this child the animal, this white mouse, and make a loud noise. So pretty soon what happened was Albert started to associate the shock of hearing this loud noise, like, oh my God, that's a loud noise, with the mouse. And he gave little Albert a phobia, right? He gave him a phobia, not just of mice, but really anything with white fur. And there's quite a famous picture of Watson kind of hunched down next to little Albert. Little Albert's freaking out because James Watson has a Santa beard on, and the caption underneath it says, "Now he fears even Santa Claus." Right, so he made this young child scared of really anything with white fur, right? Teddy bears that had white fur, cotton, white mice, Santa, you name it. Of course, this is kind of a huge urban legend around little Albert. You read all kinds of different things online about what happened to him later in life. Really, nobody knows. I don't even think Watson really kept in touch with them or anything. And of course, his name wasn't Albert. But that doesn't stop people from posting stuff on the internet. So if you do start searching for it, you'll find all kinds of crazy stuff out there about what happened to him. So that's the classical conditioning part. There's others, right, with learning. It's not just classical conditioning. We also have operant conditioning. Whereas classical conditioning is associated with Watson, operant conditioning is associated with B.F. Skinner. So with operant conditioning, this is a little bit more active of a process. What's happening is you're not just associating some kind of stimuli or some kind of response with the stimuli. What's happening is you're kind of based off the law of effect. It's the consequences of the action. So this is where we're talking about things like reinforcement and punishment. So if I do something and I get rewarded for doing it, I'm probably going to do that thing more often, right? If I raise my hand in class and my teacher says, "Great question, I'm going to reward you by giving you a Snicker bar," and I like Snicker bars, I'm probably going to raise my hand more often because I got acknowledged and I was given praise and I was even given candy. This is awesome. But if I raise my hand in class and the teacher says, "I'm sorry, are you seriously raising your hand right now to ask me a question and interrupting everything? What stupid question do you have?" I never do this in real life, but I'm just saying, if that happened, would you be willing to raise your hand again? Probably not, because you just got chastised for asking a question, right? In fact, you probably wouldn't even go to that class again. And for good reason. You got punished in a way, right? There was a negative consequence, so you're not going to do it anymore. Now, I said negative consequence to that. This is the big part of operant conditioning. Remember that this is where we talk about reinforcement and punishment, but there's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, positive punishment and negative punishment. And it doesn't have anything to do with good and bad, right? We think negative and positive, like in the sense that I just used, of being, oh, that's bad reinforcement, that's bad. With this, the positive and the negative is referring to whether or not something is being added, being done, being given, that'd be positive, or if it's being taken away. That is really important to know because sometimes you have things like positive punishment. Like if a kid's misbehaving and writing on the wall, parent sees it and just starts spanking the heck out of that kid, beating that kid. That's considered positive punishment. And it confuses people because you're like, that doesn't sound good at all. Are you saying that I should do that? No, I'm not saying you should do that. The legal thing's going to come across the screen. Or do not do that. It's considered positive punishment because you're doing something, right? You're hitting a kid. You're committing a felony to prevent them from doing something. Positive punishment. Punishment just means limiting a behavior. Reinforcement means increasing it. As I mentioned, operant conditioning does operate off of the law of effect. So behaviors followed by consequences that are satisfying are more likely to be repeated. Behaviors followed by unpleasant consequences are less likely to be repeated. Generally speaking, we talk about when we give reinforcement, we're trying to increase a behavior, that what those reinforcers are can be varied. Sometimes we look at primary reinforcers or intrinsic reinforcers, things that just naturally kind of feel good and are good to us, like food or praise. Sometimes those are more immediate, but the thing is, like the food association, you see where that's not used that much with kids anymore. Because what ends up happening is kids start to associate food not just with fuel for their body, but as being a reward. And that's really bad. So the example I gave about, if I'm in a classroom and you're asking a question, I said, that was the best question ever. Here's a Snicker bar. Back in the day, and when I was a kid, we did get candy quite a bit. Not in college, but earlier on, yeah, we got candy a lot. And a lot of people ended up making this association that candy is a reward. It's something that's great. It's something that if you're feeling bad, you eat candy. And, understandably, obesity rates are very high because people associate emotional states with that food. So generally, we try not to do that anymore. Those are still primary reinforcers, though. But what's often given more times than not are what's known as secondary reinforcers. So a secondary reinforcer is something that doesn't have its own intrinsic inherent value in itself. That doesn't necessarily mean it's worthless, though. So a good example of a secondary reinforcer is money, right? And think about it. Money in and of itself. I'm talking about the actual, like, $50 bill, right? I'd be happy. You can give me a $50 bill, I'd be happy with a $50 bill. But I'm not eating physically that $50 bill, right? That's not doing anything for me. It's what I use that $50 bill to buy that matters, right? So I can't eat a $50 bill, but I can go to a restaurant and pay for a meal with it, right? So that's what makes a secondary reinforcer. Just an important distinction to make. It's one that's kind of confusing. And again, I have videos on this that I'll make available so you can see those if you want a little bit of a refresher. Famously with operant conditioning also, B.F. Skinner's kind of associated operant conditioning with the Skinner box. So this is the early experiments that Skinner did where he put these mice in these little contraptions and there's a lever on one side. And this is really how he came up with the 4 different types of operant conditioning, which again, those 4 types are positive punishment, positive reinforcement, negative punishment, and negative reinforcement. So the third component to behavior is, remember I said it's classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Third component here is observational learning. Well, the big contributor for observational learning was Albert Bandura. Those of you who took Gen Psych and remember this, you probably remember them talking about the Bobo doll experiment. Really famous experiment that happened mid-part of the 20th century in the United States, where children were demonstrated with a lab assistant kind of beating the heck out of a Bobo doll. It's a big, like, blow-up balloon kind of thing. It was like a little weeble wobble, so basically it sat on the ground, but if you smacked it, it would just kind of bobble back and forth and always right itself. It's called a Bobo doll. So what happened in this experiment was all these kids saw a lab assistant just beat the heck out of it, right? They got frustrated and started beating the heck out of it. Then they took these kids, they put them in rooms with a bunch of toys, had them enjoy themselves for a while, and then took out those toys. But they left the Bobo doll. And what happened was that a lot of these kids basically started beating the heck out of the Bobo doll the same way that they saw those lab assistants doing it. And the idea here is that basically the kids were shown how they should act, and then acted that way themselves when the opportunity presented itself to them. The vast amount of learning that we do isn't through classical conditioning or operant conditioning, it is through observational learning. And when we talk about the overarching theory behind that, we're talking about what's known as social learning theory. That was what it was originally called. That's when we were applying this aspect that Bandura came up with to learning. The more kind of comprehensive, inclusive word we use now is social cognitive theory. So that applies a lot of Bandura's research, not just to learning, but also things like cognitive processes, internal processes. And really with Bandura, even though we're talking about him with behaviorism, he also had a big role to play with cognitive aspects of psychology as well. So this theory proposes that learning occurs in a social context through a dynamic and reciprocal interaction of the person, their own behavior, and the environment around them. A big part of this is what's known as reciprocal determinism. So that's kind of the interplay between our personality and the way we interpret events and how they influence us. A big part of Bandura, his theory, and this whole idea of like observational learning and action really is contextual, right? So I always like to say reciprocal determinism. I'll explain what that is, right? It's very context dependent. I'm somebody who tends to be extremely extroverted, right? I don't mind being around people. I don't mind being in public. I, most of the time, kind of feel recharged by being around people. That's just who I am. That's part of my personality. But I'm not always that way, right? Nobody is a certain way 100% of the time. It's context dependent. Now, if you put me in a classroom where I feel safe and I feel confident and I feel secure, and I've done this a million times before. I have the experience in teaching. It doesn't matter if there's 300 people in front of me. I know what I need to do. I feel comfortable with it. I'm going to be an extrovert. But you take me and you put me in a party with a bunch of people I don't know. This happened, I don't know how long ago. At this point, it's a couple of years ago, where my wife took me to a charity kind of event because the place that she was working for at the time kind of made her go. So I had to go to, and it had a theme. It was Enchanted Scotland or something like that. I had to wear a kilt. So here I am wearing a kilt in a big room with a bunch of people I don't know. A bunch of people I probably really didn't want to know either. And maybe I wasn't as extroverted, right? I didn't necessarily change who I am. It's the way it was manifested changed because the situation changes. But a big part of reciprocal determinism isn't just your personality or your inherent qualities in the situation. It's also your perspective, how you view. And in that example that I gave, I felt really kind of insecure. I felt kind of weird. I didn't know a lot of people. But then about halfway through the night, I had this realization. I'm like, you know what? Maybe I'll meet a friend. Maybe I'll meet somebody, that I wasn't expecting to meet. It'll be a really cool experience. Even if not, hey, I'm wearing a dress, right? I know it's a kilt, but a kilt's still a dress, folks. Sorry. Hopefully I'm not offending anybody. It felt like I was wearing a dress that night. I'll never have this experience again. Let me just enjoy it while it lasts. And then that kind of got me out of that funk. So you can kind of see the interrelated aspects of that reciprocal determinism. When we're talking about this, we're obviously talking big time about observational learning, right? So the idea with observational learning is that it is very passive. It's something that you pick up just from being exposed to it over, years in some cases. And oftentimes you engage in the behavior that is being modeled to you, that is being demonstrated to you maybe years down the road. You see this come up a lot with things like violence and abuse. So if I'm a young kid and I'm seeing abuse in the household, say, I'm a little boy and I'm seeing my dad beat up my mom. I'm noticing that. I'm paying attention to it. I'm having that behavior being modeled. I may not identify with that, but chances are I'm probably going to start demonstrating some of those behaviors. This is one of the reasons why you see kids who have been abused or witnessed abuse, where they may start doing things like being bullies at school, or you'll see them behave a certain way with their toys. Will they be really violent with them? Or in some cases, sadly, you see where young kids will even abuse animals. But then later in life, they start seeing themselves as being that dad role, as being the husband, the boyfriend. They start dating and they start using those same patterns that they were shown as a kid. Now, it isn't a guarantee, right? There's plenty of people who came from horrific, bad, awful, violent backgrounds that never engaged in activity. Just like there's people who come from amazing, wonderful, healthy backgrounds that do end up being violent and engaging in abuse. This is an example of correlation not being causation, right? Even though those things are strongly correlated, it doesn't mean they cause one another. Now, a big part of the social cognitive theory or social learning theory, when we talk about that modeling and how it transpires, it really consists of 4 parts, right? So attention, retention, initiation, and then motivation. So with attention, right, first you have to be paying attention to something. Retention is that you're remembering what is being shown to you. Initiation is the learner must be able to execute or initiate the learned behavior. You'll also see sometimes that initiation is referred to as reproduction. And reproduction in this sense doesn't mean like sexual reproduction. It means like you're mimicking it. And then the last one on here is motivation. That you, without really being prompted on your own, are demonstrating or engaging in that behavior. So we'll go back to the example I just used, right? If I'm a young kid and I'm seeing my parent beat the other parent, I'm seeing that violence. Is it something I'm going to notice? I'm going to pay attention to? You better believe it. Even if I'm trying to ignore it, it's there. Attention. Retention. Am I going to remember it? Yeah. I said this a little earlier, right? Really strong emotional events lead to really strong memories. You see something like that, it's triggering fear, it's triggering anger, it's triggering all kinds of different emotions. So you're definitely going to remember. You're going to retain it. Initiation or reproduction, like motor reproduction, you're mimicking it. The example I gave earlier, right? It's not really uncommon for kids who have seen violence or abuse to do that themselves. You know, a big part of development, we'll talk about that especially with early childhood, is that kids kind of mimic things around them, right? They play dress up, they play pretend play. Well, sadly, if you're seeing violence, you know, that is where then you have kids that are doing things like bullying. They show violent acts on their toys and dolls and stuff, or maybe even on animals that they see around them. So that is the reproduction or the initiation part. And the last part on there is the motivation, right? That you are engaging it on your own when you have a situation that presents itself. So if I'm a young kid, I'm seeing all this violence, I'm paying attention to it, I'm remembering, I'm retaining it. Maybe I'm reproducing it on my own. But I'm 8, 9 years old. You know, I may not be in that situation of being a mommy, a daddy, a husband, a wife, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, or whatever until many, many years later. But then once I'm in that role, because I just passively have learned this throughout my life, it's going to be easier for me to kind of fall back to what's familiar with me. So that is behaviorism. Now I'm going to transition into cognitive perspective. Remember, cognitive psychology really kind of replaced the psychoanalytical or psychodynamic perspective in psychology, really about the mid part of the 20th century. So cognitive theories focus on how our mental processes or our cognitions change over time. When we talk about cognitive growth, we're going to be talking a lot about Jean Piaget, and especially throughout the semester, right? That's not just now. So Jean Piaget developed the theory of cognitive development, which is a discontinuous or a stage theory, as a comprehensive theory about the nature and development of human intelligence. Really what happens with Jean Piaget, what he believed, was that as kids grow, as they mature, their brains grow, their ability to think and to reason grows. And as they do that, their idea, their sense of the world is expanded and grows too. So really you can view this theory as being how a child understands the world around them and how that changes and grows throughout their childhood. With Jean Piaget and the theory of cognitive development, there's some very specific terms. This will be another one that I'll have links to a very short, specific video on, dealing with things like schemas and assimilation versus accommodation. So you can imagine, right, what a kid understands is capable of understanding, say at 2, 3, 4 is going to be quite different than at 6, 7, 8, 9. Sometimes we get our understanding wrong and we have to change it. So the way that we change our schemas, kind of our existing framework of what makes sense around us, is through either assimilation or accommodation. So, for example, this is the way I explain it in the video that I'll link. You know, if I'm a young kid, I'm making sense out of the world of what a bird is. I'm developing a schema of what birds are, maybe just because I see birds, you know, in the backyard of my house every once in a while. And they're usually like pigeons, you know, doves, crows, things like that. Now, imagine if I'm that kid, and that's my understanding of what a bird is, but then I go to the zoo. My parents take me to the zoo, and I see a parrot, or I see a parakeet, or I see some like really colorful, beautiful looking bird. And I'm thinking, wow, that's a bird? Like, that's crazy because all the birds I've seen are kind of drab. That would be assimilation, right? You're adding something else. You're starting to understand, oh, not all birds are kind of like a drab color. Some of them are really colorful and pretty. With assimilation, the schema that you have established stays the same. So in this sense, a kid seeing a crow, right, and knowing that's a bird because that's what they've always seen, well, they're probably assuming like, okay, well, birds like have feathers, birds are animals that can fly, birds have beaks and they have wings. So if I see a parrot, I'm not changing any of that, right? A parrot also has beak, wings, feather, can fly. What's changing is I'm adding more information to it that they can be a lot of different colors too. Accommodation is where something from that list, like what I just mentioned, beaks, wings, feathers, can fly, you find out is wrong. So say that same kid now sees a penguin and their parents tell them, a penguin's a bird. And the kid may be looking at it like, is it a bird? Because it doesn't fly. It has wings, but it uses those wings to swim. And it has feathers, but those feathers definitely don't look the same as like other bird feathers. Well, in that sense, now that kid has to learn through accommodation. Not all birds fly. Something that they thought was true was wrong, and they had to change it, right? And that's what happens with accommodation. So with accommodation, it has 2 C's because you're changing a concept in the schema. Good way to remember it. Assimilation has 2 S's because the schema is staying the same. All you're doing is adding to it. Now, with Piaget, there are 4 established stages to his theory. Remember, it's discontinuous. First stage goes through to about 2 years of life. Like with everything else, those ages are real flexible. First stage is the sensory motor stage. Sensory motor stage is where the kid's brain isn't really fully developed. What is developed is their ability to move. It's not super developed, but it's developed enough. But especially their senses, right? So hence the name, senses and motor skills, sensory motor. Kids make sense out of the world through mostly what they can see, taste, smell, hear, touch, and feel. That's it. This is one of the reasons why kids are real inquisitive, right? They may stare at stuff for long periods of time. They're real sensitive to sound. They like putting stuff in their mouths. Now, for each of these stages, certain little like milestones or events that they have to go through, or key aspects. So for the sensory motor stage, one of the big kind of milestones that kids go through is object permanence, which means understanding that just because something isn't there, it doesn't like cease to exist. Right? So if I only make sense out of the world through my sight, what I can see, and my mom leaves the room, my mom doesn't exist anymore. Right? Shows back up and my mom exists all of a sudden. When object permanence happens, they understand my mom didn't fail to exist. She doesn't, not exist anymore just because I can't see her. Big, big milestone. Stranger anxiety, very important, usually happens early in life, very common for infants especially, to be very kind of reluctant and have a little bit of like nervousness when they're around new people especially, right? Because they usually attach very strongly to their primary caregiver. So that could even be siblings, family members, things like that. If they're not their primary caregiver, sometimes they may feel a little nervousness around them. Going into the second stage, pre-operational stage. This is from about 2 to 7 years of age. I consider this stage to be kind of the stage of fantasy and make-believe. So kids' brains are developing a little bit more. They're able to make sense of more things, but they don't have a lot of experience to pull from. They're not really able to think logically yet. So their way of making sense of the world is through fantasy and make-believe. So this is the stage in which you believe in things like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and even things that are really kind of abstract and weird, like, the wind. Like, I don't know how the wind happens, but I guess maybe it's just because the trees are cold and they shake, like they shiver like I shiver, and that causes the wind, right? So they think all these like really fantastical kind of ideas. Oftentimes they use symbols, images, they engage in role playing. There's a couple real key aspects here we'll talk about extensively when we go into early childhood, but things like conservation, that even if you change the appearance of something, it doesn't necessarily change what it is. Real famous experiments done on this where they take like two glasses with liquid, but if a child sees that one of those glasses is bigger than the other, they'll think that the bigger glass has more stuff in it just because it's bigger, right? So conservation, when a kid understands conservation, they understand just because it's a bigger glass doesn't necessarily mean it has more like fluid in it. Kind of weird to think of, but we'll talk about that again in early childhood. A big part of the preoperational stage is egocentrism or development, removal of the egocentrism. So early on, basically kids are just really selfish, right? They can't really think of other people's views, beliefs, perspectives, and that those beliefs and perspectives may be different from their own. So like I said, they're kind of selfish. That is the egocentrism. About halfway through the preoperational stage, that egocentrism starts to be removed, and what replaces it is something called theory of mind. Theory of mind is where you start to understand just because I think something, I view something, somebody else may have a different view. And that's something that arguably I'd say some adults struggle with, but I'm saying the capability of it starts to be present in early childhood. Concrete operational stage. This corresponds roughly to middle childhood, so about 7 to 11 years of age-ish. In this, children are beginning to replace the fantasy, the make-believe, with knowledge, with facts, with information, because they're learning. They have a greater ability to remember stuff. They're beginning to kind of think a little bit more. They're not really thinking for themselves as much, but they're able to think logically in very real terms, right? So that's where the concrete comes from, right? Children can think logically about real events. That's where the concrete is referring to real events. So not abstract information, not what if hypothetical types of things, but actual real palpable types of situations. The conservation that I mentioned earlier is kind of mastered within this stage. Children start to establish what's known as reversibility, that objects can be changed and then returned back to their original form or condition. That's a big part of this. The development of the ability to do math is a really big thing within the concrete operational stage. And then the last part of Piaget's stages is what's called the formal operational stage. So this kind of roughly corresponds to adolescence, give or take. This is the last stage, according to Piaget, although as we go into early adulthood, you'll see where there's some debate about this. Some people say there should be a fifth stage, but according to Piaget, this was it. So Piaget's theory did not go throughout the whole lifespan like Erickson's did. In the formal operational stage, what's happening is that the ability to do those concrete operations, right, real operations, remember I said in the previous stage that doesn't apply to like abstract reasoning, what if scenarios, hypothetical. Well, that's where this becomes possible now, right? So kids are able to start thinking more abstractly, more about hypothetical situations, what if scenarios. They're able to start connecting dots between consequences of actions. Now, keep in mind, right, this is adolescence. The ability to do these things doesn't necessarily mean you're doing them regularly. Right? Very important to point out. And also remember, this is a stage that begins in adolescence, but really goes on throughout our whole lives. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. That's one of the kind of somewhat criticisms here with Piaget. So you see a couple of them. First one, newer research, and this is really not just Piaget, but really all of the cognitive theories, but it's kind of mostly applied to Piaget. So newer research supports a model of development that is more continuous than Piaget's discrete stages. So Piaget very much so believed in a discontinuous level of development. But some of these things, don't really seem to be clear milestones. It's just stuff that happens kind of little bit by little bit. Especially when you talk about things like egocentrism. Other research suggests that children reach cognitive milestones earlier than Piaget describes. Again, don't focus too much on ages when you're going through this information, because sources always change, ages always change, they're very flexible. And also, their generalities, their averages, there's always going to be kids who are going to be outside those averages. Across cultures, there is considerable variation in what children are able to do at various ages, and Piaget may have underestimated this. And then the last part on here, many developmental psychologists suggest a fifth stage of cognitive development. We'll talk about this more when we go into early adulthood, but it's called the post-formal stage. And in that stage, basically what they think is added in addition is that decisions are made based more on circumstances, and logic is integrated with emotion a little bit more. I like to say one of the big parts about post-formal thought is that you start to understand that you kind of have to change your views and how you present them based on the situation. The way I like to explain this is it's sort of like we all wear different masks sometimes, right? And that's something that you learn from experience, and it can be very nuanced. The way I act as a professor is quite different than the way I act at home. It's quite different than the way I act with my buddies when I'm out, fishing or something like that. It's quite different than the way I act when, fill in the blank, right? We all kind of have to change a little bit of who we are, how we manifest ourselves based on the situation, context dependent. That's a big part of the post-formal stage. Being able to understand just because I'm angry doesn't mean I can lash out at other people, that there's consequences to that, and kind of integrating emotional stability into my thinking is something that comes more in adulthood than it does early on. One of the big parts, it's not really so much on here, but remember, Piaget really strongly believed that it was what your brain is capable of doing. One of the biggest sort of criticisms, I guess if you want to call it this, Piaget wasn't aware of it at the time, but your brain is actually continuing to form and mature well past adolescence. In fact, most people are shocked, but the last part of your brain to become fully myelinated is your prefrontal cortex. So this is the area sort of just behind your eyebrows, give or take. That part of your brain isn't really fully myelinated or mature until your mid to late 20s, and for some people even into their early 30s. And that's the part of your brain that deals with things like advanced logic, hypothetical reasoning, really advanced, kind of more higher order human functioning is handled there. So just something to kind of keep in mind. Information processing approaches to development. Oftentimes you'll see where information processing is sort of presented as an alternative to Piaget. It also is something that oftentimes kind of has more of a transactional belief. So a lot of things with information processing sort of breaks down whatever it's talking about in terms of like how a computer operates. You'll see a lot of times, right? So you see here emphasizes continuous pattern of development. We do not just respond to stimuli, we process the information that we receive. Most of the time when you see information processing being referenced as a theory, it's referenced to memory. So I said it's sort of like a computer. Our understanding of how memory works is like a computer. You input information to the computer, you then save that information in order to retrieve it later in life or later in time. Like your memory, right? You pay attention to something as you input it, you remember it, store it, and then later you think back on that memory. You retrieve it. So we'll definitely be talking about information processing when we go over the memory portion. There are some other non-Piagetian theories, and Piagetian is a very difficult word to pronounce, so I'm happy I did that without stumbling on it, especially as this lecture is getting a little bit longer. One of the key parts with cognitive psychology, especially more recently, is tying cognitive psychology into neuroscience. It's kind of a natural marriage, if you will. When we talk about cognitive, we're talking about thoughts, emotions, feelings, intelligence, language. Well, back in the day, they had limited knowledge of the actual physical, anatomical, physiological functioning of the brain. More recently, through use of things like PET scans and MRIs, we know a heck of a lot more than they did back then. So being able to connect the dots, as I mentioned with Piaget, that, he kind of said adolescence, that's it. Well, we know through looking at how the brain develops that the prefrontal cortex isn't even fully developed until your 20s to even 30s in some cases. Kind of puts a new doubt in some of those different theories in the past. So that's where the cognitive neuroscience comes in, right? That's where we're kind of tying the psychology with the biology. Carl Rogers and humanism. So this is, humanism is somewhat of a non-Piagetian cognitive theory, but it is also kind of its own thing unto itself. And a lot of times what you see is that humanism is oftentimes kind of interspersed with all sorts of other theories. So it's not at disagreement with other theories, it can be added along with them. And you see this a lot even with doing therapy, like in psychology, things like that, where people use a humanistic approach. So Carl Rogers is really famously associated with humanism. And Rogers emphasized the importance of self-actualizing tendency in shaping personality. So basically the self-actualizing is sort of like, you can think of becoming the person that you want to become, right? Achieving the goals, achieving that goal of becoming who you want to be. Over time, a person starts to develop a self-concept. So this is as we grow, especially with this, we're really talking about that self-concept kind of becoming more entrenched from middle childhood, adolescence, early adulthood. We start to develop this sense of a self-concept, right? Our thoughts and our feelings about ourselves, about who we are. And that's based upon our own thoughts, but also mostly feedback from other people, interactions with other people. Really what ends up happening is we start to develop this real self versus this ideal self. So the ideal self is sort of like the person that we want to be, and the real self is the person that you actually are. It's what the reality is. Now, sometimes these are really wildly out of whack. And early in life, that's kind of normal, right? If the ideal version of myself is somebody who has a wife, who has kids, who's married, who has a really successful job, who's a college graduate, well, if I'm 20 and I'm going to college and maybe I'm dating somebody and it's promising, the real version of myself isn't that ideal version, but it looks like maybe I'm kind of taking steps towards that. I'm moving in that direction. So in that case, even though the real self and the ideal self are out of whack, they're achievable. The problem is that sometimes we end up having a pattern where the ideal version of ourselves is something that's not obtainable and isn't based in reality. If I'm 6 feet tall, but the ideal version of myself is somebody who's 6'7", I'm well into adulthood, right? I'm not going to hit a sudden growth spurt in middle adulthood or something like that. The ideal version of me just isn't practical. It isn't realistic. But that could lead to me having a lower self-esteem, lower self-concept, lower self-confidence, all these other things that could really influence that. So this is really what we're talking about with humanism. When we talk about that matchup, really, if you will, between the real self and the ideal self, what we're talking about is something called congruity. So it's how closely a person's real self matches up with the ideal self. And the idea here is that a high level of congruence is good, right? This is where either the real self and the ideal self are close or the same thing, or if it's not, it's where the real self is kind of moving in the direction to achieve that ideal version of ourselves. The incongruence happens with what I said, when it's kind of not based in reality, not practical, that it's going to happen. Another big part of Rogers and about humanism, and this is something that's definitely integrated really throughout a lot of developmental studies, but especially in psychology overall, is this idea of unconditional positive regard. So with unconditional positive regard, it really is trying to give a patient, in this sense, just as much kind of comfort, support, encouragement as possible. Excuse me. Not to be judgmental, not to pass advice off onto somebody, right? So you're not going to go to a psychologist, a therapist, and be told, this is what I would do. You should do what I would do. Or, oh my God, you want to get married? That's so weird. You're not married yet. You're in your 40s. That's odd, right? That's not a good thing, right? It should be the sense of kind of unconditional, just positive encouragement and support for the person. Now, that doesn't always mean everything that you say is going to be encouraged. I was like to throw that out, right? If you say, go to a therapist and you're talking about how you're abusing somebody or something, I'm not going to say, that's great. You should be the best abuser possible, right? You're going to get somebody saying, we're stopping that behavior. So those are extreme examples. Another aspect of humanism is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is another one that undoubtedly many of you are probably very comfortable with, familiar with. Basically with this, it's kind of interesting. It's a discontinuous kind of theory. But when we talked about discontinuous theories, we talked about how you go through certain milestones, and it's sort of like once you go through that milestone, you can't go back. Well, this is a very flexible type of discontinuity, discontinuous stage. What Maslow believed was that there were certain basic fundamental needs that needed to be met. And when more basic needs are met, it allows us to go through that process of self-actualization, of kind of striving towards our ideal versions more and more. So at its basic core, the first most basic needs that must be met are these fundamental physiological needs. We have an absolute need for food, for water, for shelter. Once those basic needs are met, then we have safety needs that need to be met, right? It's not just enough to eat once. I need to have the security of knowing I'm working a job. I have access repeatedly to food, right? I don't just have a roof over my head for one night. I have a house that I can live in. So those are guaranteed, right? Those are safety concerns. So that deals with things like long-term safety of your body, having a job, having stable housing. Once those safety needs are met, then you can start going into what I call like relational needs or love and belonging, right? Establishing friendships, family relationships, maybe dating, pursuing romantic interests. Once those needs are met, we can then move on into esteem issues, right? So these are things that help build our self-confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. That can be things like if you're a college student and you're going to college, you're working towards a certain goal. You're doing these things for something, right? Because you're trying to build a confidence, achievement, you're trying to achieve something, get a better job later in life, maybe even get some respect from others, get respect from yourself. Finally, when all these needs are met, we can finally reach that period of self-actualization. And this is really where you're just doing things for the sake of doing it, right? So with esteem needs, we're doing stuff because of a benefit. Usually it's like an external benefit. Like you going to college, maybe something you want to do, but you're probably doing it because you want to get a better paying job later in life or more financial stability or something like that. Self-actualization is when you're doing these things just for the fun of doing them. I like to say self-actualization is like, if I always wanted to learn Italian, because Italian is just a cool sounding language to me, I think it sounds really pretty. I have no intention of going to Italy. I don't need it for a job or anything like that. It's just something I've always wanted to learn. Right, so I'm sitting here, everything's going good in life. I'm reading my, Rosetta Stone, Babel, Italian. Life is good. But what if all of a sudden there's a calamity? What if a tornado destroys my house? What if I live in Florida? What if there's a massive hurricane comes ripping through, destroys my house, destroys my place of employment? Am I still going to be sitting there, with my little Italian, how to learn Italian book? Che bella! No. Right? Because what happened was I immediately was pulled from the self-actualization stage down to where now I do have to worry about food, water, shelter, safety needs, physiological needs. So that's where I say this is very flexible. It's not like once physiological needs are met, you never have to worry about those again at any point in your life. This is always important as a therapist and anybody doing developmental studies because these are basic needs that must be met. If you have a kid who's going to school but they don't feel safe and secure in their own house, or maybe they're homeless, you're not expecting that kid to learn and know everything they need to learn and know from school in that type of an environment because those basic needs need to be met first. Now, another part of cognitive psychology, very important part, one that's often overlooked and that many of you probably never heard of before, was done by a psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. So he was a Russian psychologist about mid part of the 20th century. He's not as widely known by a lot of people as, say, Jean Piaget. And that's a couple reasons behind that. The first one is that he's Russian, so he grew up, he lived, he did his work in the Soviet Union at that time. Obviously, that was one of the reasons why he's not more widely known in the West. But also, he died at a very young age. I believe it was from tuberculosis. So, whereas Freud, Erikson, Piaget lived well into old age and really produced work throughout old age, Lev Vygotsky didn't. He only had a very small window where he actually was able to contribute. Dying very young. I think he was only about 35 when he died. Excuse me. His theory and his views are very much based on the contextual perspective, right? So it is not, absolutely not, important for you to know, a discontinuous theory. It is a continuous theory. It holds that through the context of how development occurs, that the relationships between individuals and the physical, cognitive, personality, social, cultural, and environmental influences on their development, right? So all these different things that kind of come into play. Vygotsky believed that social interaction plays a critical role in children's learning. So this is another big contrast between Vygotsky and Piaget. Piaget really believed a lot of it was just kind of biological growth of the brain, cognitive growth of the brain, and what it was able to do. Vygotsky believed that that growth happens through interacting with other people. So 3 themes in Vygotsky's ideas of sociocultural learning. First one, human development and learning originate in social, historical, and cultural interactions. Those are sometimes shaped through guided participation, right, where a learner actively acquires new culturally valuable skills and capabilities through a meaningful collaborative activity with an assisting, more experienced person. Oftentimes, that happens through the use of scaffolding. So this is where teachers model or demonstrate how to solve a problem and then take a step back, offering support as needed. That scaffolding, it says teachers, really, it's not just educational, like that teacher role can be a parent, that teacher role can be friends, it can be mentors. It's anybody who's more experienced. Second big theme here, the use of psychological tools, especially language. Another big difference between Vygotsky and Piaget. Vygotsky absolutely had a focus on language as being a key part of psychological growth. So he believed that language especially and other psychological tools mediate development of higher mental functions. Third component on here is that learning occurs within what's known as a ZPD, or zone of proximal development. The difference between what a learner can do without help and what they cannot do. I always like to say it like this, right? For something like developmental studies, I am the more experienced person, right? I know this material. I've gotten graduate education on this material. So you starting out in this class don't know everything that's going to be covered in this class. There's going to be stuff, I hope, that you're going to learn. That's part of the zone of proximal development, right? There's things that you're capable of learning. There's not one thing we're going to talk about in class this semester that you're not capable of learning. You just don't know it yet. You need a more experienced person, me, to show you, to teach you, to demonstrate it. Now, that's done through scaffolding. It's done through giving you the information, giving you support, testing it, right? So you can kind of think of that as the process of acquiring those behaviors, the scaffolding. Getting towards the end here, folks, real close. So the next one, this is not a cognitive theory. It's kind of its own little entity. It's Yuri Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. So this is really more of a social or sociological theory. Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, with it, the qualities of a child and their environment interact to influence how they will grow and develop. Now, sometimes people get confused with that ecological because we automatically assume that's like the environment or something, or like the ecology, like, a rainforest. In this sense, though, what we're talking about with ecological is a natural environment. His theory stresses the importance of studying a child in the context of multiple environments. So the environment that you're in right now, right, growing up, could be your house, your folks, your core. Trying to think of what I'm trying to say here. Your immediate caregivers, right? Maybe the environment that you're in, that natural environment, especially when you're a young kid. As you grow, you start going into early childhood, maybe that environment then isn't just your core parents, your core family unit, but now extended family. As you start going to school, now maybe your natural environment also involves the school. It involves your neighborhood. It involves your community. Maybe then as you continue to grow, now it's involving things like when you're going through adolescence and adulthood, your job, outside friends, meeting somebody new, all these different things. And then you can even go out further and say your natural environment also includes things like the culture you live in, the society you grew up in. So you can almost think of the ecological systems theory as sort of like being an onion, right? We have the more immediate, closer environment, but then as we go out, these are ones that still influence us, environments that still influence us, but maybe not as directly, maybe not as immediately. Now, this has been changed to the bioecological model. You'll see it referenced in both ways. It really does just depend. The reason why it was changed to bioecological is to recognize the importance of biological processes in development as well, and kind of how they influence one another. Kind of going back to that psychosocial overarching perspective. In addition to this, and you see here the different names of these different systems. So like microsystem refers to like family, school, health services, peers, like those more immediate, directly interacting environments. Mesosystem, as we kind of go out further, this is more like small group settings. Exosystems is where we're dealing more with larger aspects, right? This is where we're talking about like the communities we live in, neighbors, politics, all the way out to these macro systems, which are really more like what we're interacting with on a large kind of cultural standpoint. So you can say macro systems can be things like the culture of the United States. Another aspect of this is what's known as the chronosystem. So that also is incorporating the historical contextual framework of where we're at, right? The culture of the United States is what it is now as part of the chronosystem, but it's not the same as it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, 100 years ago. It's probably not the same as it's going to be 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now. Next one up is the evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary perspective is pretty basic, and this really does harken back a lot to Charles Darwin, just the theory of evolution, right? So the evolutionary perspective seeks to identify behavior that is the result of our genetic inheritance from our ancestors. It is mostly focused with biology, but not entirely. It is definitely more rooted in the nature side of things also. But there is aspects of it that does relate into things like psychology. Like you see here, evolutionary psychology is a theory, whereas we look at kind of the evolutionary contribution, if you will, of different psychological phenomena. So I'll give you an example of this, right? Some people who really strongly adhere to this would say something like anxiety is so common now, right? People have problems with anxiety, and will probably continue to be a problem, increasing problem in the future, because even though a person with anxiety problems may have problems with that may impact their life, that from an evolutionary standpoint, having really high anxiety may actually be beneficial, because people who have higher anxiety are more aware of threats around them. They're usually quicker to respond to those threats. So they live longer. If they're living longer, they're able to pass those genes on for high anxiety to their offspring. And generation after generation after generation means people with higher levels of anxiety become more common. Now, I'm not saying that that's true, and it really boils that down to a very, very, very easy to follow example, overly simplistic example. But that is kind of like the reasoning here behind evolutionary psychology. And of course, a lot of this does kind of go back to genetics, that kind of looking at the role, and this is really purely on the nature side of the nature versus nurture, what role genetics kind of play with our development. Last slide here, and one of the big things to kind of take from it is this eclectic approach. So I threw a bunch of different theories at y'all. I didn't really go into a massive amount of detail. A lot of them, again, I'll have videos on many of these theories like Piaget, Erikson, Freud, that you can connect with, as well as things like the behaviorism, the different aspects of behaviorism. But most developmental studies, especially when we talk about the developmental psychologists, really do use what's known as an eclectic approach, right? So it's not just that they believe in one theory and only apply that one theory. I like to explain this, the eclectic approach is sort of like a painter, right? I have a lot of different colors I'm going to use to paint whatever I'm going to paint. Most developmental psychologists have a lot of different theories they use to help people, to study developmental studies. And really, you can say that not just of psychology, but really any kind of developmental scientist is going to look at a lot of these different things. It's not just focusing on only one perspective or one view, because again, development is just so comprehensive. There's so many variables, and it's very nuanced. So that is where I'm going to leave you all today. I know I covered a lot of information, but thank you all very much. And of course, check out those additional video resources to help expand your knowledge a little bit more or be a refresher to information you may have learned in previous classes. Take care.